So with that, I will turn to the panel and guess have a bit of an introductory question, and I'll introduce each of our panelists as I go to them. So for each of our panelists, I'll ask you to kind of tell us a little bit about what your organization works on and what you focused on at COP. And if you weren't at COP, kind of what your organization's main focus surrounding COP was, and a little bit about your main takeaways surrounding what happened at COP. So really just getting a general vibe at this stage. So I'll go first to Áine, who was a COP delegate with Young Friends of the Earth. And Áine, I'll let you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Beth, for having me. So Young Friends of the Earth is the group that I'm from. We're a grassroots network of young people campaigning for environmental and climate justice. And we're part of the wider Young Friends of the Earth Europe group. And our work kind of focuses on community building and knowledge sharing within the climate movement. Myself and my co-delegate, Molly O'Shea, focused on the climate finance negotiations and more specifically advocating against false solutions such as carbon markets. And I'm sure I'll expand on this later, but to briefly kind of explain these concepts, kind of a false solution is sort of like a term used to describe policies and practices that give kind of a false or an untrue perception as to their effectiveness. And an example of this that kind of came into play in COP was carbon markets. And again, in kind of simple terms, these markets allow governments and corporations to buy and trade carbon credits to offset their emissions. And obviously, the issue with that is that the actual emission reductions created are often only a tiny fraction of what's being written off. So it essentially allows for a license to continue emitting. And we also, we supported other climate justice campaigns on the ground, for example, anti-LNG campaigning, and also solidarity with our Indigenous and Palestinian colleagues, friends. We also did kind of worked on this kind of knowledge sharing objective and collaborated on workshops on climate finance, but also giving kind of daily recaps on social media to kind of give people an idea of what it's like on the ground at COP. And I think our biggest takeaways were that climate finance is an ongoing battle. I'm sure the panel will discuss this kind of at length, but there's still trillions more needed in commitments for the for the global south. And that there's this huge importance of pressure and visibility from the public and civil society to get climate back on the high level on the political agenda, and also, kind of reinforce what we already knew, that it's a climate justice is going to be a fight that's happening on the ground through activism, through people. So that's why I'm so excited to get to speak to all of you today.
Thank you so much, Áine, and as well for outlining kind of those false solutions, because I think it's something that a lot of people are aware of. So it's really interesting to hear about them from you. I'll now go to Jessica, who's the European Network Coordinator at the, what an amazing acronym, Alliance of Non-Governmental Youth, or ANGRI. So I'll go on to Jessica now.
Hi, yeah. So this is actually one of my last engagements as the European Network Coordinator for ANGRI, or the Alliance of Non-Governmental Radical Youth. And pretty much what our key work is at COP is ANGRI was set up by a lot of young people who have been involved in the COP process for a while, especially after Fridays for Future really took off 2018 to 2019. And from being involved back then, one thing that we really noticed was the tokenization of youth voices as a way to kind of launder false solutions, as Áine kind of outlined what they are. But yeah, youth voices were really being used to kind of launder them and make them seem like greener solutions. And as well as that, we realized that the youth voice that is represented currently is through Youngo. And to us, that represents one portion of the youth. I'll explain a bit what constituencies are within the UN process. One of the difficult things to talk about with COP is the fact that there is such a learning curve of just ridiculous acronyms, ridiculous processes. And once you get through them, they start to make sense at some stage, but it's very difficult learning curve to get through. Constituencies within the UN are the UNFCCC are essentially like union bodies for specific stakeholders. So countries have powers within that process. That's where we get the outcomes from it. the people who are in the room making the big decisions, but to make sure that it's not just countries that get a say. Big stakeholder groups like farmers, indigenous people, business and industry, researchers, all of them have their own constituencies in which they're able to object to parts of the process. And there is a youth constituency, which is called Youngo. But unfortunately, we found that that isn't truly representative. It would be like asking to represent all people within one constituency. It's never going to really vocalize it for everybody. So for us, our mission right now is to build a constituency for those other voices that get unheard. So that's for Indigenous youth, that's for grassroots organizations, radical organizations, direct action organizations. So our goal within the COP process has really been to try and get that unheard voice out there and to kind of combat, again, the youth washing of false solutions. So that's us. And our takeaway from this COP really would be that the COP process right now is to some extent failing and needs to it needs a huge restructuring. And I'm sure we'll get more into this, except that one thing that we really notice is that the COP process right now, in the way that it currently is formatted, is really taking the countries who are dealing with the climate crisis the worst. It's kind of taking them hostage because they don't have a better system, so they have to work within this one. But right now, the process it's ineffective, and it's being led by the biggest polluters in the room. And with stakeholders within the fossil fuel industry having big say in the conferences. So our takeaway would really be that the system needs change. It needs to be completely reformatted to some extent. And we hope that as like the representative voice of radical and grassroots organizations, that we'll be able to push for that. And at COP, our main focus this year was really that kind of protest element, and also education for people not at COP to be able to understand the issues with the current process.
Thanks so much, Jessica, as well, for explaining constituencies, because you're so right. I think it can be so difficult for like people coming into it, and even people who've been in the space for a while. And I think we'll definitely get more into those kind of issues with the COP space and the presence of polluters definitely a bit further on. So I'll go on to Sumaya now, who attended COP with UCC, but is also just a fantastic activist in lots of different groups. And Sumaya, I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of answer the question as well.
Thank you so much, Beth, and hello everybody. I'm so happy to be here today just to chat about COP and upon reflection, because it was a really crazy time and I don't think you actually realize what's going on until you take a step back, even weeks later, to be like, whoa, that just happened. But yeah, like Beth said, I went to COP with UCC, but I also went with my other organization, Somalis for Sustainability, of which I became the Associate General Secretary this year. And our main focus at COP this year was, along like Áine, about climate finance, but more so as well about climate education. So our big focus in S4S is movement building and capacity building, especially in underrepresented places, so exactly like Somalia. So a lot of our focus was talking to Somali negotiators who are at COP, talking with the Minister for Environment at COP, and all these type of things, and trying to get where they think the gap is between people in Somalia who are at the brunt of the climate crisis and themselves who are able to come to conferences like this and advocate for Somalis in Somalia who are facing the climate crisis. So that was a lot of our focus there, and obviously building our organization because it's fairly new. And it was really good this year. I think I went to COP27 when I was 16, and I just for a bit of a background, I got involved in climate when I was 12, and I co-founded the organization Students Climate Action Network and Climate Youth Activists. So at COP27, I was honored to be a delegate for a scan, but I went alone. I went alone, and I was with my mom for a little bit, and it was quite it was very overwhelming to be there, especially that young in these type of spaces. And I'm sure we'll touch on that later on. But I obviously made great friends while I was there. But then the difference this year, I went with the UCC delegation and I went with Jessica as well, and myself and Keen. Our main focus as well for some of this was following kind of the G77 and China negotiations. And just a bit of a background, that just refers to kind of the discussions and diplomatic efforts between the Group of 77, which is a coalition of developing nations, and China on various global issues. which are like trade, climate change, sustainable development, and whatnot. So we tried to get into some of those negotiations and just follow them on, and as well with the loss and damage finance facility, which was established at COP27 and finalized in COP28, but still not implemented yet. But yeah, I think our key takeaway, especially from S4S, about COP was that the COP system definitely needs reform. This is we're about to go into our 30th year of COP, and things haven't changed yet. Now, is that saying that the COP system is absolutely useless? No, we'd be on a much worse path if we didn't have the COP system that we did now, but it's just simply not enough, especially when people are suffering right now, because this is not a future problem. So I think our key takeaway was that we definitely need to be doing movement building, capacity building in most affected areas, and amongst each other, amongst our friends, and making sure that we're empowering one another to try and create change, because without that, we're going to be stuck in this cycle of kind of just discussion. So those were our key takeaways from COP29.
Thank you so much, Sumaya. And again, as I said, I'm sure we'll be able to go more into the kind of the piece around COP. And I think it's an interesting point you make in terms of whether or not it's fit for purpose. So really looking forward to hear more about that as well. And I'll now pass this on to Dearbhla, who is the Irish coordinator for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yeah, so I actually wasn't at COP this year. I was at COP27 and COP28. But it was on this year at the same time as the elections. So, like our elected officials, I chose to stay home. Which, no, I was working on a campaign at the same time around the general elections. Our candidates like standing for election to commit to I guess like a fossil-free Ireland. So there was a kind of a range of different commitments that we had asked of them. But there were plenty of the team from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative who were attending the COP, who we're all working on a lot of things that have kind of been outlined by other people on the panel. So a lot of kind of movement building, capacity building, network building, and we also held our second senior officials meeting of the endorsing nations of the fossil fuel treaty and our second ministerial meeting of endorsing nations as well. So for anyone who's kind of unfamiliar with the fossil fuel treaty, essentially what it is a global campaign aimed at I suppose establishing a treaty for a phase out of fossil fuels. So there's kind of three pillars that the treaty stands for or stands on. So just transition, so to make sure that no one's left behind in this process. So non-proliferation to make sure that no new fossil fuels are extracted, and then the full phase out as well. And to make sure that that phase out is equitable, and again to that kind of based on principles of equity and polluter pay principles also. So making sure that people who are responsible for the crisis are financing a lot of like that transition away from fossil fuels as well. But yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, the kind of main goals of the treaty at the conference were, trying to, I suppose, continue that engagement with endorsing nations, and also trying to get more governments to commit to joining or participating in conversations around the development of a treaty as well.
Thanks so much, Dearbhla, and I'll actually stick with you for now for the next question. Kind of going off what you were saying about the fossil fuel treaty and its demands. So some of you listening may be familiar, but if you're not, at COP28, we actually had the first ever mention of fossil fuels in a COP decision. So it took 28 of these conferences to even mention what's causing this crisis. And this year, we unfortunately didn't see much progress on mitigation. A lot of it has been pushed to next year. And so, Dearbhla, I guess, what do you think are the main reasons why we've seen such slow progress on ending the fossil fuel era? And what do you think we need from countries, including Ireland in particular, to make this happen in a fair and equitable way?
Yeah, so I guess it kind of it's kind of talked about a lot in these kind of conversations, but I think kind of the biggest issue impeding progress is the influence that like fossil fuel lobbyists have on these conversations, and the fact that they often send delegations that are often quite larger than say like the sum of like 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 country delegations, because of the power and money that they have. So an example of this would be that in at COP28, there was 2,456 fossil fuel lobbyists who attended the COP. And then at COP29, this number was a bit smaller, but because the overall delegation for COP29 was much smaller, so 1,700 people had attended. And when I was at COP28 as well with a lot of my fellow panelists, we had these like little stickers that said like not paid by the fossil fuel industry, because you actually didn't know when you were speaking to someone whether or not they were, because there were so many people. I remember, I think it was myself and Sumaya ran into this girl who was speaking to us, and we were just kind of having a conversation, and then she started talking about how good fossil fuels were, and she was like our age, and we were like, oh my goodness. So she actually was like paid by the fossil fuel industry to attend like the conference, and it was just I guess a very kind of stark contrast of the objectives of why we were there and what we were doing, and I guess the kind of hijacking that goes on in those conversations. So that's definitely one element of the slow progress. I think as well, the fact that these corporations have long known the consequences of climate change and the consequences of fossil fuel extraction, and they've hidden like these scientific, reports that they've made, because they don't want people to know that they did actually know this entire time that these were the consequences of their actions, and they proceeded with them regardless. And I think kind of then on the other side of that, and obviously it does still contribute to it, there is a lack of incentivization to move away from fossil fuels. So I don't know how many of you live in rural areas, but the public transport is really bad. And in Ireland there's like my partner lives in an area where buses go twice a day, so once in the morning and once at 6 p.m. and there's no bus on a Sunday. So you need a car to get to his house, basically. And there's not really any, I suppose, effort that's being made to kind of counteract those living situations that people find themselves in. And I suppose in the last government there was, some effort, not enough, but some will acknowledge it, put into public transport and kind of, improving that infrastructure that we have. And, this current government, there's just been less of that like focus on public transport and ensuring that people will be able to kind of access it that way. And then kind of, I suppose, on the other side of that, in terms of, sustainable solutions and alternative solutions that people have, we're kind of constantly being introduced to like kind of the electrification of fleets or the electrification of cars. And people are priced out of it. There's absolutely no way that like I'm ever going to be able to afford an electric car. And it's just because they're insanely expensive. And then it's like, there's an expectation of people to kind of move away themselves. But that's, again, I suppose the issue on the progress from moving away from the fossil fuel era is that all of the responsibility is placed on an individual consumer rather than on the corporations themselves. So that's, I guess one of the big issues. And I suppose moving then to kind of with Ireland as well, like Ireland isn't a big Ireland, well, not a big, they're not a producer at all of fossil fuels. We are really dependent on fossil fuels. But we've banned fossil fuel exploration on our shores, and it isn't something, I'm not sure if you can hear my dog barking, so if you can, apologies. Um, but yeah, like our main issue is this dependency that we have, and we've seen this dependency, especially like over the last few weeks with like the storms and how many people were without power for so long. And part of that was because of the demand on the electricity grid from data centers. So because of that, and because of the amount of fossil fuels that they're consuming, it kind of all just is interconnected, and we're always kind of left in this situation where we'd be better off with renewables, but it's also really difficult to move away from them without the supports in place. And, we do need that element of the just transition to be there and to be able to, I suppose, call it like an equitable phase out and to make sure that, we aren't leaving people behind. And I guess like part of what is important in doing that is that kind of like supply and demand element, because if we move away from fossil fuels, then there won't be as much demand in like the big countries to like produce more, because they won't need as much in kind of the global scale. And we're seeing this a lot with LNG infrastructure. So it's really likely that the kind of new LNG infrastructure is going to become a stranded asset, because so basically it means that it won't be used. So there's all these plans to make all this infrastructure, and it's unlikely that it would be used considering the rate that we are like moving away from fossil fuels. But that doesn't stop, all these governments who are big producers continuing to extract, despite the fact that it is like it's not necessary. Even with heard this recently that we have enough fossil fuels to like continue to use them until 2050. And we're still continuing to extract them. Even though we actually have enough, and they're continuing to extract regardless. So one kind of, I guess, startling fact about this is that governments plan to produce 110% more fossil fuels by 2030 than what would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, and 69% more than what would be consistent with limiting to 2 degrees. And the majority of that planned expansion is Canada and the US and Australia. But in terms of what kind of needs to happen there, it's fairly obvious that we need an equitable fossil fuel phase out. And as it stands, there's a lack of technical and financial support for countries in the global south, though there is considerable political will in a lot of those countries. But they can't do it without our support. And even when you take, I suppose, for example, the 16 nations that have, committed to coming to the table and, discussing the development of a fossil fuel treaty, there is so many of those countries who again won't be able to do that transition unless they have that support from countries who do have those like resources. So that's, I guess, like one element, circling back to like our three pillars and the kind of, I guess, framework around a treaty or what that would look like, is that we need like countries in the global north, like Ireland, to phase out first and fastest. So to make sure that because we've already all exceeded our carbon budgets, we really have. And what we really need to do now is to start winding down in a way where we can, look after our own people who are working in sectors that will be affected, but also in a way after the people who need to use fossil fuels for development until, sorry, my dog's going crazy. But so what we really need to do is make sure that we're looking after those people, and that we are that the countries who are historically responsible for historically responsible for pollution, that they are paying their fair share, and that they're supporting these other countries in this transition.
Thank you so much, Dearbhla. And I think really good points to link the influence of the fossil fuel industry to some of those outcomes we've been seeing, kind of the wider systemic change as well as the kind of negative impacts of reliance on fossil fuels on like ordinary people day to day. So I think moving kind of in a similar vein to Áine to kind of talk a little bit about false solutions and what you were campaigning on at COP29. So as you said, you and Molly did a lot of work on kind of carbon markets and kind of this notion of false solutions and ideas that are being put forward. And some of you may have seen in the media a lot of coverage of the carbon markets negotiations at this COP, given that this had been, I think, since the Paris Agreement, back at COP21, they've been trying to figure out a solution for carbon markets for a very long time. The negotiations finally concluded this time around. There was a lot of controversy both over the agreement itself, given a lot of skepticism, rightful skepticism around carbon markets, and also some procedural issues. So I guess, Áine, would you be able to explain Young Friends of the Earth's stance on carbon markets themselves, and also kind of any stance on how negotiations proceeded at COP itself, given some of the things we saw, say, in media coverage around COP, and what you think needs to happen going forward. And I know that's a lot to try and answer in 3 to 4 minutes, but yeah, thank you so much.
I will do my best. So if anyone hadn't noticed, yes, Young Friends of the Earth are firmly against carbon markets, because they're not a real climate solution. They're a colonial capitalistic permit to pollute. These markets are allowing big polluters to buy their way out of cutting emissions rather than making real emissions reductions. And what we saw was COP29 further validating this complete fallacy that there's this magical get out of jail free card that exists, that we can hand over some cash and somehow not have to reduce emissions. So this decision to expand global carbon markets has opened up floodgates for hugely harmful consequences, particularly for communities in the global south and Indigenous people. We have seen very serious issues throughout the years, including, double counting of emission reductions, human rights abuses, and rampant greenwashing, which essentially is when these corporations are falsely claiming to be carbon neutral through this double counting and false accounting. So to kind of give some kind of statistical insight, while we were on the ground at COP, the Nature Communications report came out, and that estimated that less than 16% of the carbon credits issued thus far constituted actual real emissions reductions. And that's coming from over 2,556 different projects that were evaluated. So that's a really, really concerning number. So, one of this kind of, again, these bigger concerns are the lack of legal safeguards to protect human rights. So far, carbon offset projects have directly led to the forced displacement of Indigenous communities in the global south, violating their fundamental rights and severing them from their land. So, for example, you can, if you want to read up on it more in yourselves, the Rights and Resources Initiative and McGill University published a paper highlighting how in 2014, over 1,000 homes were burned by the Kenya Forest Service to evict over 15,000 Sengwer people from their ancestral homes, as this land was then purchased for a carbon credit. Obviously, this isn't climate justice. These, real solutions have to enter that support frontline communities that actually cut emissions at the source and uphold human rights and not sacrifice them to some capitalistic corporate gain. And to kind of highlight how even this got even more concerning, to move around to kind of the procedural issues, and as someone working in governance, this did hurt my heart quite a lot. So the plenary opened on day one, and for kind of COP veterans, this wasn't necessarily surprising, but there was a 7-hour delay. So they lost about 10 minutes before they had to take a 7-hour break to argue about the agenda. And straight after that, the Article 6 or 6.4, the carbon markets, this decision was gavelled through or pushed through by the presidency without an opportunity for kind of deliberation in the plenary. So this was a rogue move from the supervisory body to start the COP off with a win, but approving these carbon market rules without discussion or debate actually sets a very dangerous precedent for the entire negotiation process and the overall trust in the negotiation process. It's really important that these documents from the supervisory body go through the conference of the party properly and, don't bypass the state's ability to discuss and revise the standards before they go into effect. The state oversight and party-led contributions are critical, and now this has resulted in very risky rules that are believed to lead to huge human rights violations and environmental harm. So going forward, this has been done. This decision has been made. So our role as, the public, as civil society, as activists, as young people, is to keep a very, very tight eye on carbon markets and actions by decision makers. And overall, it is the responsibility, of course, of decision makers and scientists and civil society to enhance the accountability and transparency in governing these processes. And this very strict oversight is beyond necessary, considering how risky that this decision has been. And of course, I would love to see a more legal framework safeguarding, the indigenous peoples from these horrific land grabs and fundamental human rights abuses. So that was a very lovely picture but I hope I answered every element of your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for anyone interested, I've sent a link to one of the institutes Áine mentioned if you want to read up more. I think that was the one you mentioned, Áine, the publisher report. And so, as you say, obviously civil society being NGOs, young people, protest groups, etc., for anyone who's not familiar with the term, who attend COP play such a crucial role in kind of that accountability piece. And we know that there's often a lot of organising around various different issues at COP. So turning to Jessica, like many climate activists, Jessica, you've also been heavily involved in organising around Palestinian liberation, and that was something we came up a lot. We saw came up a lot at COP28 last year and at COP29 this year as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the link between climate justice and justice in Palestine, how Palestine came up at this COP and any previous COPs as well that you've seen it come up at before, and the main changes you think we need to see?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the kind of confusions that people have when it comes to why we talk about Palestine when we talk about climate justice is kind of the idea of social issues kind of being separate things to the climate crisis. And I think that one thing that really helps when looking at the climate crisis is kind of being able to understand that it's not necessarily a crisis in its own right, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. The climate crisis is really the end point of a lot of the injustices that we see in society in general. So the systems of exploitation that we have, basically. So the idea of looking at land and people as a means for profit are the things that led to this climate crisis in the first place. And we see that in the way that, you know, Indigenous peoples and in Ireland ourselves, we had a much more harmonious relationship with our own land pre-colonization, and it was the profit-seeking motives of the colonizers who came over and of corporations that have taken over that really led to the issues that we have now with carbon emissions, with worker exploitation, all of that. And Palestine is really just the place where you kind of see that all coalescing now. The occupation of the land in Palestine is a really key example of Indigenous practices being lost when it comes to land. So you have, on a very basic level, even the way that the natural wildlife has been driven off the land, the natural flora has been burned down and uprooted to be replaced with pine trees, because they have a more European look to them, and they make Israel kind of the European stronghold of the Middle East, in their own words. And without understanding the impact that that would have on the land there, that has led to rapid desertification there, and it has led to basically a huge reduction in the water levels of the Jordan River going through there, and so you have those those much like smaller level issues when it comes to Palestine, and with like looking at the ways that this relates specifically to climate justice, and to the idea of our land, and then you also have the ways that this ties into Palestine being occupied as a means of colonialism. The reason that Palestine isn't occupied land is um, because Jewish people were promised that land by England after the United Kingdom after and the US after the Second World War. And then you have the ties that has to Ireland in terms of our colonialism being entwined with it. So for example, like you have Lord Mountbatten, who obviously was key to colonialism here, also having a key role in Palestine. You have the Black and Tans being brought from here over to Palestine to oppress people there and to kind of begin the process of driving Palestinians off their own land. So there's all of these historical ties that we have to Palestine, and the ways that it kind of relates to our colonialism, and the ways that it relates to the loss of Indigenous knowledge when it comes to caring for land. And at COP, I think that one thing that you see a lot is imperialist countries and countries that are committing crimes against humanity will use the climate as a way to be able to greenwash their actions. Greenwashing is a process by which you kind of paint your actions as environmentally friendly to justify them. So Israel claims that they are making they're making their land this haven for climate justice in a lot of ways, despite the fact that they have huge ties to the fossil fuel industry. And in the COP process, you can see them really milking that role and using that as a way to justify their continued occupation of Palestinian land. And the role of civil society then, when we push for talking about Palestine, when we push against the occupation, is really to reject narratives of greenwashing and to reject the idea that you can have a colonial land, you can have a land, and you can have a colonial state that is committing genocide and still be for climate justice, because at the end of the day they are mutually exclusive. You cannot be a genocidal settler colonial state and then also push for climate justice, because climate justice inherently means it inherently means social justice, and it inherently means tearing down the structures that led us to this crisis in the first place, which is anything that is colonial, anything that is profit seeking.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And I guess bringing all of that together that all of you have covered, because a lot of you have touched on various different issues in the COP process and ways that the COP process is potentially misused as well. I think turning now to Sumaya, in your advocacy, you've spoken a lot about how countries which have contributed the most to this crisis and have extracted, resources and things like this, have taken insufficient action and are kind of delaying action. And I guess in your earlier statement as well, you spoke a little bit about the problems with the COP process. So I don't know, this is quite a big question, but I guess, do you think COP is still fit for purpose? And if not, what do you think needs to change, or do we need something else entirely?
Yeah, it is. It's a difficult one to answer. Um, I think I can only answer it like actually just encompassing my own emotions towards COP and how I even came to kind of my main point of advocacy to be in regards to the inequalities re global South countries and global North countries. And I think coming back from COP27, one who goes there, you can only actually feel how draining and how frustrating it is to be in a space where you really do not feel listened to. And it's not just young people, it's actually people as well from the global South. And I remember being at COP, and I was there a day early alongside Jessica. And we were actually protesting outside one of the negotiation rooms. And then I was talking to this Bangladeshi negotiator. And he came out and he was like, guys, thank you so much for doing this, because we were holding banners that said, no deal is better than a bad deal. And for context, this was when they were trying to go through with the 300 billion climate finance, which ultimately got approved, unfortunately, which is simply just not enough for countries in the global South. And he was like, do you see the circus that's going on there? And I was like, no, what's happening? And he's like, it's a circus. They're all in a huddle, as in the EU and America and whatnot. And he was like, and all of the countries like the LDCs and India and the Africa group are shoved to the side. And I was like, how do you feel? And he was like, I feel like the last 10 years of my life have been a waste. And hearing that, and then also seeing these negotiators who are absolutely drained, eating like really regular food, like KFC at 3 a.m., being absolutely drained, falling asleep in these negotiation rooms, it humanizes it that these are the people that are being kept in these inhumane places, trying to negotiate for their country. I think that's going to change the trajectory of the world. And I guess my whole family being from Somalia really highlights the connection I feel towards this crisis. Because when I was at COP27, Somalia was facing the worst drought it had ever faced in 12 years. And my family back home were lucky enough to be unaffected by this crisis. But with an economy dependent on agriculture, facing the worst drought ever faced in 12 years, like I feel like you could put two and two together in that regard. And I feel like being from both Ireland and Somalia, my outlook on this crisis has really become crystal clear, is that the global North likes, especially at COP conferences, to condescend countries from the global South, telling them that they're going to loan them money, telling them that they're helping them recover from maybe a typhoon that hit, offer, let's say, Pakistanis after new waterborne diseases emerged from the floods that occurred that were induced by the climate crisis, which were perpetuated by countries from the global North. this isn't aid, this is not loan. It is simply returning the money that countries from the global north extracted from these countries during their centuries, years, decades of colonialism. And we see it with the phrases like developed world and developing world, like lesser economically developed countries and whatnot. Colonialism is rooted in these hyper processes, and this is just a neo-colonialism outlook. Colonialism hasn't gone away. And I think, again, like COP29 highlighted this deep divide between like global north countries and global south countries when it comes to climate responsibility and action. And I think a major sticking point, especially my organization, SRES, is that the negotiations read the Loss and Damage Fund, like which were first established at COP27, like I said earlier, were still underfunded. Like the global south keep on trying to push and push, but global north countries then began to deliberate on things like, let's say the word parties were there, deliberating on the letter S, deliberating on really tiny grammatical errors, or not even errors, grammar, period. And it's absolutely ridiculous. And then the time has elapsed, the meeting is over, and then they're going to wait till 3 days later to discuss it again. I think another big part of the problem with COP that's a lot of people have debated, is it positive, is it negative, is the way that the negotiations are structured. So right now we have so many COPs. We have the COP for climate change, which is COP29. We have the COP for biodiversity, and we have the desertification COP and ocean COP. And these are all tackling interconnected crises, but operating in silos, operating in separate entities, which is just, it's bizarre to some and it makes sense to others, but I think that the climate crisis isn't just about emissions, or it's about collapsing ecosystems. It's about disappearing freshwaters, like the destruction of livelihoods. It's about real people every single day, like you and I. Like even in Cork, we're facing the brunt of the climate crisis. Not the brunt. We're seeing the symptoms of the climate crisis here, and I think that's one of the debates surrounded by the COP process. And I guess, like I said earlier, I think we do need a reform. This is the 30th COP. It was established in 1995. The first COP was in Berlin, and we're still using the exact same system despite all the technological advances that we've seen in the recent 30 years. So I think that whilst the COP system we have now is just, it's not fit for purpose due to the absolute accelerated nature that we need to be tackling this crisis. It's a system that we have right now, and we can simultaneously advocate for a reform, advocate for something new, advocate for a new system that includes everyone and doesn't leave anybody behind, while simultaneously also working with the system that we have. And I think, especially now studying law, that's kind of an outlook that I've kind of grown to appreciate a little bit more, that you can do both at the same time. You can still advocate for a reform, but also make sure that you're utilizing the system that you have now, making sure that you yourself, especially as young people, don't get left behind in these processes, despite maybe feeling unheard or tokenized at these places. So to recap the question, yes, I do think COP needs to have reform, but I do think that we must utilize the system that we have, especially as youth. So that's my.
Thank you so much, Sumaya. And with that in mind, we'll open the floor to questions. And I see we have some in the chat already, so we'll work through them. And anyone else who has a question, please feel free to either pop it in the chat or raise your hand. If you want to do that, you can go to the react button, and then I think there's like a raise hand function, and then we'll be able to unmute you. But we have a question here from Alex Duffy from UNESCO. Hello, Alex. And so, as Alex says, we've heard a lot about false solutions and the various different issues you all have discussed. From your perspective as young experts, what are the real solutions needed? And also, thank you, Alex, for a very kind message at the end of that. So I guess this is open to any of you who'd like to answer. I might ask our panelists to keep answers in the Q&A to about 1 to 2 minutes if you can. Would anyone like to go first? Feel free to unmute.
I guess this is a little bit of a cheat answer because I'm going to pass it off to Dearbhla in a second. But yeah, to me, one of the big things that gives me hope as the COP process itself almost starts to feel like a false solution is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and similar like processes led by civil society that really look at very much just the concrete things that we can do, looks at the big complicated mess that we've made out of trying to solve this crisis, and looks very objectively and just says, okay, well, if the clear thing that we need here is a phase out of fossil fuels. Let's simplify it all down and looks at that. I think that's a huge thing in terms of like the big solutions. And then I think that in terms of like, I think that as like people, like just like living our day-to-day lives, I think that it can get very difficult when we're looking at these kind of big processes and kind of seeing the only solutions being kind of those like those huge processes that like are completely separate from us and are just for politicians and experts. And while I don't think that individual solutions will solve this crisis, um, I do think that in our own lives we can make solutions too. You know, that's organizing in your local community, that's seeing what issues you can solve, and that's seeing how the climate crisis is affecting your daily life, and then pushing as much as you can to both on an individual level and find ways that you can solve that, but also look at how these structures affect you, and then target them directly. So I think that's a huge thing. But yeah, I don't know if Dearbhla wants to say anything more about the fossil non-proliferation treaty there, although I feel like you gave a pretty good summary of it earlier. So
Yeah, I think just kind of echoing what you said, like it is one of the and I'm going to be a bit cynical, but one of the few things that's kind of left that gives me hope. Because for me, the biggest hope that I find is in collective action. And for me, the treaty kind of gives the framework for that. Like it kind of acknowledges, well, it does, it acknowledges the root cause of the climate crisis, but it also, I guess, amplifies the fact that, this like fossil fuels are so often left out of the conversation, which is crazy. It's crazy that, we have all of these frameworks that just like don't mention fossil fuels at all. So like the Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels. This like we had a conversation yesterday with like a panel, Mary Robinson and other kind of development actors in Ireland around the SDGs, and the SDGs don't mention fossil fuels, and yet fossil fuels impact every single one of them. And they're all interconnected. So when one isn't realized, none of them will be realized. But yeah, I guess in terms of the kind of real solutions, I think it's just, again, like, taking tangible action, but also listening to the experts, because this is something as well that I find so frustrating from having like conversations with like, policymakers and government officials, is that, we do actually have all the answers. Like scientists have actually come up with all of the answers and what's necessary, and they've written them down. And it's just that no one's listening. And I think it's literally just to listen to, it might seem very simple, but just listen to the experts, Greta Thunberg like wrote a book, and it was like specifically like outlining and amplifying the voices of everyone on like what specifically had to be done. So I think it is just like referring back to the people who have studied this for a really long time, who have solutions, who know how to implement them, and just making sure that we prioritize people over profit in those solutions. But yeah, I guess like in terms of kind of like smaller actions, if anyone wanted to take action on the fossil fuel treaty, some things that you can do is get your organization to endorse, or get your local council to endorse, or get your university to endorse, or get your school to endorse. And kind of just keep the conversation going and keep the pressure on the government, just to try to show them that, it's kind of it's something that's it's said a lot in these spaces, but it's something that I like to continue saying, that there another world is possible, and sometimes it feels like we're on the cusp of it. But yeah, so just to continue to as Jessica said, like organize, mobilize, and like keep that pressure up, because we do have all the answers. We just need to listen to them.
Thank you. And I've sent a link to the fossil fuel treaty in the chat because I am a big fan. It's one of those things that I think just makes sense when you hear it. So 10 out of 10. I don't know if Áine or Sumaya would like to come in on anything there.
I think you guys have put it so beautifully. I think the only thing I would like to add, and again, it highlights everything that's kind of been said before, but this kind of overriding theme of, injustice and power and the imbalance of power within that, it's so important that, we as individuals also understand that there's systemic change necessary to produce real climate change mitigation in reducing emissions, and that comes from the companies that operate around us. It comes from how our government systems operate, the data centers, everything like that. Individuals' consumption, as we all know, is far too high to be maintainable in our current planet, but also those systems are being upheld by a larger body that's much bigger than individuals. So again, like pushing for that accountability and that understanding of kind of the more holistic view of how these are, the lifestyles are kind of perpetuating the climate crisis. I think that's really important to keep in mind also. And also that message from Alex was really sweet. Thank you.
And just, yeah, I agree. I think just to echo what everybody else was saying, all of that as well, I think comes back to the center focus of climate education and everybody realizing that they're entitled to a climate education, because how are we meant to know what to do next or how to change if we're not told how to do it? And I think in some capacity or form, and I think like it's just so important to me because I would never have gotten involved in climate if it wasn't for my sustainability short course that I got in junior cycle. And I know that I'm really lucky and able to receive that, to be a recipient of that. And not everybody is able to do that. So I think having climate education as a center focus that needs to be instilled in every single secondary school, primary school, and also universities. And that doesn't just create people who are thinking about climate change, people who are individually conscious and making sure that they're recycling and whatnot, but also people who maybe go on to become climate litigators, go on to become policymakers, go on to become activists, advocates for climate. So I think, yeah, my main kind of thing for that is climate education is a really incredible way to just foster a whole new community of climate activists in some shape or form. So.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. And I have a question from Frank in the chat, and then I'll go to Harrison, who has their hand raised. So we have a question from Frank saying, aren't developing countries such as my own, Burundi, often use COP to demand finance from wealthier countries, but most important, a place where their voice can be heard globally? So I think this was sent while, Sumaya, you were answering your question, so I might go to you on this, but obviously anyone else is welcome to come in. And I think my understanding is it's kind of looking at like, is COP still an important place for developing countries to have their voices heard? Frank, as well, if you want to unmute and ask any further information related to your question, absolutely feel free. But if not, I will go to Sumaya.
Yeah, I think 100% COP is definitely the place for developing countries to be demanding for equitable climate finance and for a loss and damage finance facility. They're doing it everywhere else all the time. NGOs and these countries themselves are doing it year in, year out. But I think COP is the place where it gets amplified the most, especially by media sources, and that's maybe why we hear it most. But it's happening year in, year out, day in, day out. But 100%, I do think that COP is a place for developing countries to be demanding for climate finance because it's the place where the decisions are being made at that point. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sumaya. Oh, Jessica, I see you trying to unmute.
Yeah, that's okay. I was just gonna hop in and say, I completely agree with everything that Sumaya said. And yes, COP is a space where those voices can be heard. I think by the media, definitely, but I think that there is definitely like what we've already spoken about here, which is the issue that COP, while it is a place where these voices get heard and there's a lot of performative talk around listening to those most affected by the climate crisis, especially in the last few years as that language has become more popular, you see it more in the processes. Like, even I have my bottle from COP here and it says like, in solidarity for a green future. There's all these kind of very big, very nice words that have kind of become part of that process. But I think that when you look at the endpoints of a lot of these conferences, you see that those voices aren't really listened to. So you see that there's kind of a lot of performative talk when it comes to them, but the outcomes are led really by polluters and led by rich countries in the global north. Whatever your preferred term is there. But yeah, I think that it's where they should be heard, and it's definitely where we get the most where they're platformed the most by the media, but I don't think that the process right now actually does effectively listen to them.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Áine or Dearbhla, unless either of you want to come in on this, I'll go to Harrison. Harrison, I'm going to do my best to ask you to unmute. I don't know if it's going to work. I hope it does. Yay.
Yeah,
Okay, feel free to ask your question.
just kind of almost touching off what Dearbhla said at one point there, like with all the kind of negativity, like from the big corporations and from the large governments who are endorsing fossil fuels, like with all this kind of push against you, how do you find you keep yourself motivated to keep pushing for this activism? Kind of, I know some of you have already touched on it a bit, but kind of just a bit more elaboration.
I actually have a great quote from Kumi Naidu, who's this activist who works with the Fossil Fuel Treaty, that says pessimism is a luxury. So it's basically just that you know, quite often people who like really disengage with like climate and because of their fear around like the consequences of what's happening are largely often based in the global north, and they kind of shut it off and they shut it out, and it's a coping mechanism. I'm not judging them for it. A lot of people at an individual level, we do have to, I guess, kind of realize that people can't do much, and we need to come together to kind of target the kind of um yeah, to actually address it. But in countries in a global south, this is a reality that they live through every single day. And they face consequences of climate change all the time, and they can't ignore it and they can't shut it out. And so because of that, they continue to advocate at every single opportunity that they get for that term we've been discussing, climate justice, and making sure that that they aren't left to deal with the consequences of like our actions. I say our actions, but the actions of the global north and largely wealthy countries. So I think that's something that definitely gets me through, is that whole idea that I don't want to leave someone else suffering when I have a voice that I can use and that I can I suppose like do work where I feel like I'm kind of like contributing or helping in that way. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But yeah, I think that it does just kind of bring me back to that quote from Kumi about how it is a luxury to kind of to stay in that pessimism. But I think that yeah, like for me, I don't yeah, I suppose I can't can't really speak for anyone else, but for me, the largest hope I feel is in collective action and collective organizing. And like my first COP, I was so lonely, and it was like a really difficult kind of experience. And even though loads of my friends were there, but it was just because I felt so helpless, and I felt like I couldn't do anything that was actually useful. And I went home and I was kind of dealing with all those feelings. And then my second COP, I realized that there was so much power in people coming together, and when you allow yourself to kind of feel that power, hope grows. It grows so much, like especially like being able to work with all of these people and hear from people who like I said, who are really suffering the consequences of climate change, but how that they can continue because there isn't actually any other option for them. And so because of that, there isn't any other option for me. And that's kind of how I think about it. But yeah, that was a great question.
Am I good to? Yeah. Uh, Sorry, I feel like I'm absolutely yapping up here, but the I this is like my favorite question of all time. But for me, there's kind of I'm always in two minds about it, where I have such hope for the future. Especially when I'm with like my friends organizing and all of that like gives me so much hope. But I think that there is just a reality that we do have to accept, which is that no matter what we do about the climate now, and I think that there is a huge there is a huge amount that we can do. At the end of the day, we are in a situation where we're going to have to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis as they currently stand. There is no way of reversing what has already been done. um and our best thing that we can do now is try and stop them as soon as possible, and try and make sure that this is all that we deal with in the coming years. um, and try and dismantle these systems that have put us in this situation. um, but that is a very difficult thing to think about, and it is something that is always going to leave you to some extent hopeless if you're only thinking about that ideal world. But for me, there's something that one of my friends and colleague from the Alliance of Non-Governmental Radical Youth talks about, which is the idea of the long defeat, which I think is a very nerdy Lord of the Rings reference. But it's kind of this idea that like there is a battle that you know that you're going to lose, but it is still honorable to fight it anyway. And I think it's one of those things where it's in the future, I want to know that I was here doing as much as I can to make the world as good as it possibly could be. And I think that for me, it's no matter what the end point of this is, we are creating the better world that we want every day by just taking action, and every day by building community and looking at the world around us and trying to make it just that little bit better. In every hopeless situation in the world, in Palestine, in Holocaust camps, there was people still taking action. One of my favorite books right now is the Blessed is the Flame, which looks literally at resistance that happened in the Holocaust camps where people knew that they were going to die, and they still did as much as they could to dismantle the gas chambers, to riot, and all of those situations in which people knew that things were hopeless. They still did their best to fight as long as they could. And for me, that's where the hope comes from. It's always going to be from just knowing that we did all that we could, and knowing that every day that we push against the climate crisis, every day that we push against all of these issues that we have in the world, we are already creating that better world within like our communities and within ourselves.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Would anyone else like to come in on that?
I think just to kind of briefly tie it up in a knot, nice bow. Kind of the way I look at it, pessimism is a luxury, and I've been accused of being a pessimist many a time. I think there's an element of you don't, as some activists, you don't want to look back and think, God, I could have done something more, on a very personal and selfish level. But then, when it kind of comes to that kind of deeper aspect of keeping going, I feel like a lot of us are powered by almost this anger, but it's a different kind of anger. There's an unhealthy kind of anger, more like affliction, that's kind of has a more like violent undertone to it that, is destructive. But then there's another kind of anger that forms and it's more concentrated into a form of determination. And I feel like that, from my observation of being a COP, working with some of the panelists here, that kind of determination is kind of center to what we do and what we have been doing and what we will continue to do. And again, that coming together is kind of what keeps us going, even when things, you feel like the whole world is against, everything you're trying to do. But then you kind of leave that echo chamber and you come into, your people fighting for, a just future. And, you get that little boost. So it's, each other, but also it's channeling your anger and frustration into determination, I think.
Sorry. I think I actually don't even know what I can say to actually follow up with all you guys have said. It's excellent, and I really do agree. But I guess one thing I do want to highlight as well is that even though we're fueled by all of this motivation and like hope for in regards to collective action, being in these type of spaces, going to these type of conferences can be really draining at times. So like I guess just kind of underscoring that it's okay to take a break. And I think that's what also motivates people to continue doing more when they have the capacity to, is that we're still young people, we're still living our lives. There was no reason that I should have been that stressed about the future of our planet at 12 years old. There's no reason at all. And it's absolutely absurd that 12-year-olds and even us, like 18, 20-year-olds, should be going on the streets or going to these UN conferences when some people maybe are doing English degrees or law degrees or something. These are not the places that we're meant to be in, but they're the places that we should be in because of the system that we have and the system that we're growing up in. So I guess just kind of highlighting that it's okay to take a break, and everybody in this community kind of knows that, and it's so supportive. And I think that's what really keeps me so motivated, is that the friendship and the community that you have in these spaces is unlike any other, because it's real and it's beautiful. Because I know when I was like 12 and we organized this strike and 5,000 people showed up and we were like, what the heck? This is crazy. And then seeing everybody, then you just feel a bunch of dread, because you're just like, wait, all these young people just skipped school to go to a strike. This is insane. And then the only way that I could actually get out of that dread was talking about it with my friends and being like, wait, this is crazy, right? It's not just me who's feeling it. Maybe we should go get a coffee and talk about a book or something like that. So I guess my hope is fueled by collective action, and also understanding that it's okay to take breaks sometimes and you don't have to be go, go, go all of the time. So, but also echoing what everybody else said, because it's great.
Thank you guys so much. I think you all really hit the nail on the head here, head there, and there were some really beautiful kind of messages you guys put across there. So thank you all so much. We have another question in the chat, and I think we have time for this and probably one more question afterwards before I move just to our final thoughts and things. So this is from Frank, and it said, and Áine, I'm going to give this one to you because it's quite focused on carbon markets, but if anyone else wants to come in, you're more than welcome to. If carbon credits are paid to pollute, why are so many companies using them along with direct emissions reduction strategies? And what alternative could we hope for that would have the same global reach and impact?
Yes, a lot of questions. So again, this is I'll never, get away from the pessimism accusations now, but why companies use them? Well, kind of to try and give a kind of simple explanation, when companies are allocated, emissions, or like what they're allowed to pollute. Let's say you're in this company and you have this really profitable project, but oh no, you ran out of these credits. What do you do? Oh, well, I can use all this other money that I have to be able to have a bigger limit so that I can do this thing, so our company can get more money, and that we can be really, really good looking because we contributed to this project, even though, the public perception might not acknowledge the actual effectiveness of this project, in comparison to the emissions I have now bought to fuel my profitable empire that I have acquired here. So that is kind of the pessimistic reason as to why I feel companies use them, but also, this kind of direct emission reduction strategies that you've mentioned, they're kind of what is more integral to kind of the system change that we're talking about. Trying to find climate justice in a capitalist system is an uphill battle that, might not be, it's probably not a perfect one. But what we can hope for, again, is this acknowledgement that we're overusing the planet's resources, and exponential growth in climate justice is a complete myth. It's not possible. We can't continue to develop and develop and develop and develop with no actual resources to do that without absolutely depleting what we do have. So, reduction, efficiency in the use of our resources, trying to push for a more equitable distribution of resources, natural and capitalistic, I suppose, is that kind of systemic aspect that we've all kind of touched on. That's probably that's the best we could probably hope for in terms of that kind of global reach and impact, because then that would be a genuine reduction in emissions and a genuine action that's taken, rather than a stamp of approval on a fallacy of exponential growth. And I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that might be less doomy. I don't know if everyone agrees with my doomingness, but I think that's it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Áine, and thank you so much to everyone who asked questions. And we really appreciate them. So I will go to the panelists now just to kind of get some closing thoughts. I might ask you guys keep these to 2 minutes if you can, just for the sake of time, so we also have time to present what I'm sure will be an amazing drawing from Hazel, which I'm so excited for. So having, I guess, reflected on everything we've discussed today, I guess what would your guys's main advice be that you would give to those listening who are hearing about COP, all these different issues, and I guess want to do something and put something into action after this call? What would you guys what advice would you give, essentially? And I'll go to Jessica first.
For me, I think that the main advice I can give is that these processes are scary and strange and full of politicians and researchers and all of these experts. And the best thing that you can do is look at how these issues affect you at home and to get involved at that level, to keep caring, because that's the hardest thing to do in the face of all of this doom and gloom, to never give up on that. And yeah, to build in your local community, find other people who care, find other people who are, find the people who are directly impacted right now, whether that's got to do with directly the climate crisis, or whether that's got to do with Palestine, or whether that's got to do with housing prices, cost of living crisis, anything like that. All of these things are related to the climate crisis. And the best thing that you can do is find how it directly affects you and combat it at that level. And then keep engaged and keep hopeful. That's pretty much all I can say on it.
I guess my main advice would to be talk about it with people, talk about it with your friends, and talk about it with people, like-minded people. So if you and your friend are concerned about the welfare of the world in regards to the environment or even social justice issues, because all of these things are interconnected, start organizing, mobilize, talk to other people about it, form an organization. Do you know what I mean? Join another organization to try and make hope into a doing word. I know that that was a thing brought up by Greta Thunberg, but that's how you can feel hope, is by taking action. So just to echo what Jessica said there, start acting, start doing something. And I feel like that would be my main advice. And also just to make sure that you're engaged with climate media and in the news from a numerous amount of sources, not just from one source, because it can be quite disturbing even to be looking at climate news, because how destructive it is and how alarming it is at the accelerated pace that the climate crisis is going at. But at the same time, ignorance is bliss, but do we want to stay ignorant in a world that's trying to make us stay ignorant, to not act, to do anything? So I guess just stay informed and organize and organize and organize. So
I'll go next. I suppose first of all, I would say get out your phone, follow Young Friends of the Earth, follow Friends of the Earth, follow Jessica Dunne especially, follow Beth Doherty, follow NCYI, follow XOR, follow Friends of the Earth, Mary Robinson Centre. Just get following people. That's how you get in the loop, because we will post things and we will let you know when things are happening, so that you can come and join us and you can, be involved in something and, kind of get to know us all and start taking action with us, and we'd obviously love to have you guys. And again, this protesting and directly pressuring our representatives is so important. This COP saw such a lack of political will in climate. We had the Trump administration was pending at the time, and that was looming over the entire process. Argentina walked, the US has now pulled out of Paris Agreement. And there were so few high-level world leaders in attendance, and we really need to get climate back onto that political agenda. And again, holding these powerful actors accountable. I think we're spoken about it, but when big polluters have such big influence over these conferences, it undermines the legitimacy and the trusts. And the fact that there was more fossil fuel lobbyists that outnumbered like many countries' delegations put together is a huge red flag. We call it the conflict of interest. There was 1,770, I believe, fossil fuel lobbyists that attended this really tiny COP. And so, of course, these false solutions came within this COP, of course, with their lovely influence that they had. But yes, get organizing, get involved, get informed, take breaks, look after yourself, but continue to advocate for a just transition. That's it.
I think it's me. But yeah, I think kind of just never underestimating the power that you have is something that I've learned over the last few years. And never be afraid to challenge someone on the right thing. Like if, like that kind of sense of justice that we all have, but that we don't always listen to it. Because um I think that we always have this kind of fear in us that, we might get in trouble for saying something, or that we might not get, certain opportunities if we speak out on issues. But I think, yeah, I guess my kind of advice would just be to listen to that and to never kind of go against your own kind of moral compass, because it is there for a reason, and a lot of the time it does guide us. And to trust yourself as well. And also never to be afraid of not knowing something, because I find that, like, especially in these climate spaces, as I mentioned, like a lot of it is so technical, and there's always like so many like really difficult kind of theories and concepts to grasp, but you can care about it without understanding those things. And obviously, like, you need to take the time to kind of, understand it, and, be able, if you're going to speak about it, to be able to kind of educate yourself on it as a topic. But like, don't make and like let anyone make you feel inferior for not understanding it, because that's something as well that, like, I find that, it's they're not accessible places, and they never have really been. They're not built for accessibility. They're built, for like lots of countries are left out of the conversation specifically because English is their second or third language, and it's like all of it is predominantly done through English. It's all done through English. Um, but yeah, that's something that I think kind of surprises other people when they meet me, is that I'm never afraid to go, I don't know what that means. And I'll say it all of the time, like in conversations in groups where there is like officials and like senior staff, where you're not actually supposed to admit that you don't know something. And I'll be like, can someone explain what that acronym means? Because I don't get it. And then afterwards, like one or two people might come up to me and say, I actually didn't know what that was either. But people are so afraid of like not being able to like, looking silly or not look like, but these places were never made to be inclusive. They're made to be like, elitist and for the most kind of educated or whatever. But we deserve to be in those spaces more than those people do, because they're not doing what they were meant to do in those spaces. So just don't let those kind of things be a barrier to you, and don't be afraid to kind of, get involved. And it's okay to start off not knowing anything, because that's where everyone started from. And they'll try and tell you different, but that's where everyone started from, is not knowing anything about what we're talking about. But yeah.
Thank you so much to all of you, and definitely Dearbhla, on your point, you're completely right. I don't know anyone who popped out fully formed into the world and was like, ah yes, carbon markets. So you're completely right. And I think all of you make such fantastic points on that. So just before I head to Emer, who's going to show us the drawing, I'm going to do some shameless promotion, which is the Climate Youth Delegate email and Instagram. So if any of you have questions that you feel like weren't answered today, or you want more resources, or any questions you want answered, please feel free to email us there, or to check the Instagram. Hopefully there might be something useful there. And if any of you would like to learn more about the panelists, you can see their bios on the webpage for the event there as well. And panelists will obviously feel free to share any links to your organizations and things that you think might be useful for people. So with that, I will pass us over to Emer, who I think will be able to screen share the drawing summarizing today's panel. Fingers crossed.
Yes, so just so all of you know, we have a wonderful graphic recorder here who basically live draws the conversations that we've been having. Her name is Hazel Hurley, and I'm just going to show some of her work right now. Please give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Yes. So as you can see here, we've got some of our discussion being drawn out. So we have the condescending global north. We're happy to give you some money for your typhoon relief. And the draining and exhausted negotiator, KFC at 3 a.m. that was mentioned earlier. So that's picture one. Picture two. Here we have our fossil fuel lobby, lack of transport in Ireland, electric cars too expensive, data centres. Number three, how does gas connect to climate change? So we've got the loss of indigenous culture, water desertification, lots of interesting points there. And then finally, our final one is the carbon markets do not equal climate justice. To keep your eye on those carbon markets, because they are displacing indigenous people, and it's basically land grabs. So they are all absolutely stunning. We're going to put them up on the website somewhere. We will be sure to send you all a link to it. Everybody who is signed up here and is here today, we'll put them up online, and I'm sure we'll be sharing them on the Climate Youth Delegate social medias as well. But can we all just say a huge thank you to Hazel Hurley for your wonderful work. Bear in mind, was drawing that blind, just listening into the conversation and drawing it as soon as they heard anything interesting. So it's amazing work. Thank you so much, Hazel.
Thank you so much, Hazel, for that. It's amazing. I can't believe that's drawn like live as well. I seriously, that is so impressive. So with that, that concludes the panel. I would like to say firstly a thank you to our incredible panelists for making the time to be here, for sharing their insights, and for sharing such incredible advice, and I guess summarizing what can be such a complex area so well, and just making it so accessible and interesting as well. So thank you all so much for giving your time, especially when I know how busy all of you are. So thank you all, and thank you as well to everyone who made it today, for asking questions, for engaging. We really appreciate you coming here and taking the time. And also a huge thank you to Emer for doing so much of the behind the scenes tech work, for sending you all emails for the links, parental consent forms for those of you who are under 18. Panel would not be able to happen without Emer doing all of that behind the scenes. And of course, thank you to Hazel for such a fantastic drawing. And with that, that brings us to a close. You have the Climate Youth Delegate email there, so if any of you have questions or would like further information or resources, please feel free to reach out or DM on Instagram, whichever is easiest for you. They're both there. And there's some more resources linked in the Climate Youth Delegate Instagram as well for understanding COP, breaking down what happened. And so yeah, thank you all so much again. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.